This week I made my annual call to my friend Christy, who is actually the mom of one of my best buddies, Joshua, who passed away about 8 years ago. And I sort of vowed that I would call her on the day of his death each August, so I did it. And Joshua is one of those friends that has a huge impact on your life while living and in death. We went to undergrad together, spent a semester together, and when I went to seminary and grad school, he went into the U.S. Army. He emailed me my first year of seminary from his post at Abu Ghraib in Iraq, where he was stationed as an interrogator. And it began this email dialogue that sort of changed my life, or at least it changed my understanding of my Christian faith. Up until that point, I thought there was a kind of seamlessness between my Christian identity and my political identity. For me as an American, I just thought it was like, hand in hand. Birds of a feather. And through Joshua's experience in Abu Ghraib, where he experienced the tension between his loyalty to Jesus as Lord and the loyalty to the state, to the United States in terms of his duties and responsibilities. I never really thought about that before. I never really thought that there could be a disjunction or a disconnect between being a citizen of heaven or a citizen here on earth. But he found that loyalty to the way of Jesus, the way of love for one's enemies, was in conflict with his responsibilities in the prison. So fast forward a few years, Joshua ends up being a conscientious objector, and he leaves the U.S. military and comes back and becomes a playwright in Iowa. He went to the University of Iowa. He started his doctorate after that at the University of Chicago in literature, and he was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. And the doctor said, "You'll have about 6 months to live." And that's what he had. And it was through his witness of following Jesus and faith, and even dying in faith, that I was a changed man by his friendship. So I felt out of that loyalty, desire to be in touch with his mom. And I was reminded this week, talking to her, that as Christians, it's really easy to mix up our identities between our faithfulness to Jesus and the church and our faithfulness to a political regime. Part of that mix-up comes out of an ambiguity at the very center of the New Testament between Jesus' teachings about the kingdom of God, which is heavenly and otherworldly, and the kingdoms of this world. So in some ways, if you have felt like you don't know always where your loyalties lie or how to negotiate the two things, maybe being Christian and American, it's okay, because it's a hard question to answer. Jesus teaches in the New Testament and is represented as the coming Messiah, which for the Jews, for ancient Israel, that meant he was a new king. He was the true king. He was the new David, as you'll remember from Israel in the Old Testament, and the monarchy and his kingship. He came and he was recognized as the Messiah. And yet he kept saying things like, "My kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is now, but it is not yet. It is coming." And to the disappointment of many of his followers, he rode into Jerusalem, you remember, on Palm Sunday on a little donkey. And that little donkey represented a very different kind of politics, a different way of running the world, the way of humility and love. And of course, his early followers were like, "Are you gonna, break the neck of the Romans who have been oppressing us for a long time? Or are you talking about the future? Is it here? Is it now?" You remember when Jesus was pressed on something as mundane as who to pay taxes to and whether or not Jews should be paying taxes to ancient Rome, he said, "Yeah, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's," things like coins with Caesar's inscription, money, "but render unto God the things that are God's." Your soul, your life, your very well-being, your very hope. So that brings up this question as Christ followers in the earliest phase of the church. Is the kingdom now or is it not yet? Is Jesus going to reign on a throne as president, or are we going to continue to be ruled over by these ornery Romans? This question of our religious and political identities was posed in the earliest phase of the church in terms of communities. Like, how do you square your commitment to your religious community, the church, the Christian community, with your identity in the political community? How do those two things relate? And the question was, are they totally at odds? Do they remain separate? Do they collaborate? Does the faith community infiltrate and transform from within? Surprisingly, historically, the first 600 years of the church, this phase of the early church that we're talking about, represent two diametrically opposed answers to that question. The first 300 years are characterized by a no. There's a no between faith and politics. Christians are on the outside. In some ways, it was by necessity because the Roman Empire went from being a republic to an empire with Caesar Augustus. They were very protective about religion because they knew that faith and that spiritual identity was core to people's participation in politics. You have to remember, the things that are most important in life are the things that you'll die for, and they're probably very, very few. Would you die for your family? Potentially. Would you die for your faith? Hopefully. Would you die for the state or your country? Potentially as well. Would you die for the football team at your alma mater? Hopefully not. But you see, these are these things that stir us most deeply. And Romans knew that if the early Christians had a different God, a different Lord, as they called Jesus, that's that Greek word kurios, where we eventually get Caesar or Kaiser. They saw Jesus as the true political leader, the one who demanded their full allegiance. In fact, the most political act in the first 300 years was martyrdom. You don't usually think of martyrdom as a political act, but yeah, the early church was all about martyrs because they were persecuted. And these were very violent persecutions, from the Emperor Nero around 60 AD to Diocletian around 303 AD. The early Christians were getting persecuted, and indeed it was death. There's great accounts the early church, the martyrdom of Polycarp that you get from Ignatius, who we've talked about before. It was this harrowing death about this guy being burned at the stake in the center of the Colosseum for his faith, for his confession of Jesus. The Romans were threatened by this confession of Jesus as Lord, as kurios. So that actually leaves Christians in a really healthy place, strangely enough, because they know you have no permanent security here on earth in this life. Our hope is a heavenly hope. Our king is not a potentate like the Roman Empire, but a humble King Jesus who we follow. And what we can do in this world is to love those who need love, those who are outcast, those who are on the margins. That's where so many of our practices in medicine come from, those earliest periods in Christian history when Christians were known to rescue babies abandoned on the trash heaps outside the cities in Rome. They were known to take care of the poor, of the elderly, of the frail, of those who were forgotten by power, because they were also forgotten by power. They were also on the margins, and they were testifying to a different king and a different kingdom. Now, all of that suddenly turns and switches almost around the year 300. So you'll read about Constantine, this first emperor who sort of converts to Christianity in 312 AD. He has a vision in a battle at the Milvian Bridge where he sees a sign of the cross and the first letters of Christ's name. And he hears a voice that says, "In this sign, conquer." Think about that. He sees a vision of Christ's cross and he hears a voice that says, "In this sign, conquer." And he goes on to win the battle and to become the sole emperor at Rome. He doesn't make Rome Christian, but he legalizes Christianity for the first time. And in that legality, Christianity is all of a sudden faced with new questions, which are questions that are hanging with us today, which is, what right does the state or the political ruler have to say anything about our faith? Should the state have something to say about what we believe and what we do as Christians? So there's a question of authority. There's also the question of ethics. How do you square your commitment to following Jesus, the Jesus who died for others, the Jesus who called us to be peacemakers, the Jesus who said turn the other cheek, the Jesus who said love your enemy? How do you square that with the requirements of citizenship in Rome or in America today, where sometimes you have to rule with an iron fist? You have to fight to protect the innocent. You have to drop the hammer. How do you square the ethics of Jesus with the ethics of citizenship? And finally, there was the question of establishment. What happens when the emperor cozies up? By the year 390 AD, Theodosius I, who not just goes with legal Christianity, but sort of makes Christianity the religion of the empire, all of a sudden sees the benefit of people following the Christian faith, being more moral, being more just, being more compliant. What do you do then when the state or the empire comes to you and says, actually, we would like the church to take care of this part of society. We would like the church to actually be the one to say which God we should pray to in our schools. These are questions that are perennial from the early church until where we are today. So this question of how do you square your political identity with your Christian identity has been perennial. In the first 300 years, the question is oil and water, they don't mix. And there's a kind of purity and freedom and fidelity and faithfulness to Christ and to the church as a kind of alternative politics on the side, which stands as a sign against the excesses of the state. In those second 300 years, from 312, let's say, to around 600, we see the birth of Christendom. We see the birth of Christendom, where church and state are fused together, and we find the benefits of an almost Old Testament-like fusion of faith in God with political life and establishment of that faith. But that also comes with its own costs. So in essence, we have three answers to this question. How do you square your Christian faith and identity with your political identity and community? The first answer was that of the earliest church, the ancient church in the first 300 years. It's a no. In some ways, being a Christian puts you at odds with the political society, and so you were free to live out your loyalty to Jesus, knowing that your hope wasn't in this world, but was in his kingdom to come. The second phase, Christendom, isn't just the next 300 years, from 300 to 600 AD, but really it runs into the Middle Ages, to the year 1000, even to the year 1500. And that is that fusion, that transformation where you bring church and state close together. You try to get their authority to touch and the ethics to touch. And there's an almost establishment of Christian faith as the religion of the empire, the Holy Roman Empire. The Protestant Reformation in the year 1500 kicks off a new phase, not just of religious life, but of political life. The church and the state begin to slowly separate, the disestablishment of religion. And you know that's true for the United States, where we have the non-establishment clause in our Constitution, that there is no church endorsed by the state. So we live in this era kind of after pagan Roman Empire, after Christendom, asking how do we Christians relate to the modern state? And I want to offer to you that the answer probably doesn't come through the merging of authority between church and state. Probably doesn't come anymore through the establishment of the church and of Christianity as the religion of the state in America or anywhere else. But it does come through ethics, through the way that we live. So the question becomes, how does your faith in Jesus and your followership of Jesus as your king impact the way you live in political society, especially if you found yourself in an official office, living out as a political official, working for the state, working in the police, working for the military, as my friend Joshua was? The number one thing that we have to think about is, how does our faith in Christ transform the ideals, the values, the institutions, and the offices of political life? That is, maybe you're a police officer. How does the humility and kindness of Christ impact the way that you use your authority and use force? It's a really hard question for soldiers in the military, as it was for my friend Joshua. And Christians of good conscience go in different directions on how can you bear out your loving faithfulness to Jesus and his ethics of a new kingdom and his enemy love while fulfilling your obligations in the political military. Then there's questions for all of us in terms of how you cast your vote. Where do you cast the ballot?
Which direction do you go? And that's the challenge of translation, you might say. How do I translate my commitment to Jesus and the ethics of his kingdom into the policies, the mundane realities of this life, how we care for the homeless in our city, how the foster care system works, how you think about unborn life, how you think about military policy. That's the real exciting work of Christian political ethics, is how do we translate this? And I want to finish with this thought. Maybe the simplest, most profound way that all of us should be thinking about how our Christian faith squares with our political identity is just simply asking, what do we love? What you love defines you, what you care about, what you give your affections and your attention to. There was an early Christian author named Augustine of Hippo living at this crossroads in the 300s and early 400s AD, seeing the persecuted church turn into Christendom and a Christian empire. And he said fundamentally at the end of the day, the way all political communities will be judged, just like us as individuals, is on the basis of the things that they love, that we love. Are the things that we love fundamentally just and true and beautiful and good? Do they lift up the dignity of humankind? Do they direct people to seek things that are above? Or are they fundamentally mundane and dragging us down, fundamentally about our own selfish interests and priorities and desires, our own lust for power, Augustine said. That's what he called disordered love. So at the end of the day, any political community, just like a church community, will be judged on the basis of the things that it loves, that it shares in common. You say, well, that sounds good, but what are you actually talking about? If you want to know what you love, just see what you pay attention to. Just check your screen time at the end of the day. Where did your attention go throughout the day? Look at your browser, the places you scan on the internet today. Look at your friendships. Look at the people that you spend time with. Look at the things that you give your money to. Just look at your bank statement from the past month. These are the things we love. They're the things that we care about, give our affections to, pay attention to, spend our time and money on. We are what we love ultimately. So at the end of the day, the Christian transformation of politics begins from and with the heart.